that assumption because obviously we've gone through with these documents now, and so you should have a pretty good idea of what the Electoral College is, how it functions. I do know that it gives you some decent background information, so again, some of this is going to end up being redundant. Okay? We've talked about some of the historical aspects of government over the course of the first month and a half that we've been in here, right? Or a little over a month that we've been in here. When we look at the Electoral College, and I'll be 100% honest with you, my personal opinion about the Electoral College actually changed on Friday. When I was out, I was sitting in a lecture up at UT Austin in which the Electoral College actually came out, and the professor did a really good job of changing my opinion. Not to what he wanted my opinion to be, but utilizing his own sort of arguments and ideologies and coupling that with what I already believe about the Constitution, my opinion did change. And when you look at the Electoral College, it's created because we live in a system in the 1700s in which information is not readily available. And this is the number one reason why so many people say that it's outdated and the Electoral College no longer serves a function. Okay? You live in an era, in a day and age, where unlike any generation before you, even my generation, right? The internet was in its infancy when I was your age, right? In which case, we had information, right? But unlike you, when I had to write a research paper in high school, I'd go to a public library and know what the Dewey Decimal System was, right? And I'm not that much older than you. Now, when you go all the way back to the 18th century, what you're looking at is a time that exists before telephone, before telegraph, before internet, cable, radio, anything like that, which means that the only means of information that you have, right, has to come from either letters, okay, which are carried via horseback and take weeks to get to you, right? Because we're also talking about a time before the railroads. So it's not even like you can throw a bunch of letters on a railroad car and it gets from Philadelphia to Chicago in 2 days, right? Instead, we're talking about a period where any sort of information takes months, maybe longer to get, right? So that lack of communication makes it difficult for your average voter in the United States to really fully grasp what's going on. Okay? So they're uninformed. I don't want to say unintelligent, but they're uninformed. All right? Additionally, we have a belief that there's a large percentage of our founders who actually do sort of believe or hold on to the ideology that most Americans are just ill-equipped intellectually to pick a president. Okay? And so the Electoral College actually becomes our compromise, because there are some individuals who wanted to see a popular vote. There are other individuals who simply wanted to see Congress cast the vote. So ultimately what we're left with, or our compromise, our middle ground, is to have an Electoral College. All right? Now, what happens is we now have to come to some sort of agreement as to how things are going to be allotted. All right? So the allotment of Electoral College votes works like this. Okay? It's basically the number of representatives that you have for the state plus 2, which is your senators. So if you look at my little map up here, okay, which hopefully any day now I'll get my new one, because I asked for a new one. All right? But you'll notice all of these little numbers. Okay? That number corresponds to the Electoral College votes. That is determined based upon the number of representatives from the state as well as the number of senators. So as you look and you notice, there is no state with a number lower than 3. All right? So Alaska, Wyoming, states that have an incredibly small population, all right, They still have one representative for the state. They have 2 senators. Now, this is done in order to ensure that it's not just directly based on the population of the given state, right? Because essentially what you do, and I talked about this once before, right? A vote for president in the state of California counts roughly 3.5 times less than a vote for president in the state of Wyoming. And so the way you sort of do the math on that is you take the number 3, and you divide it by 640,000, or however many people live in Wyoming, and so you come up with just over 200,000. And then you take the 55 in California, and you divide it by the number of people that live in California, and instead of a number of like 210,000, you come up with a number closer to 700,000, right? So do we see the disparity there, mathematically? Again, not a math teacher, but hopefully we can recognize that, all right? So then the only other thing that happens here is that you end up with the 538 votes. That's the number. You have to receive at least 51%, right? Or you have to receive a majority. And those of my students that were in class first semester, I actually showed them what I considered to be a real possibility. Now, not a good possibility. I told the kids after I did it that there was probably about a 2% chance that it would happen. But an opportunity for this map to actually come out 269 to 269. And obviously that's not what happened. But there was a legitimate shot at that being the ultimate outcome. And when I say legitimate shot, what do you mean? 2%. But when you consider the number of possibilities, 2% is still possible, at least. Alright? And now, the electors, and this is what ends up getting interesting, okay? Because this is what makes the electoral college system fascinating. I actually went back, knowing that we were going to do this yesterday, I went back and looked, because I knew that there were 7 what we call faithless electors in the last election. That means 7 individuals who were supposed to vote for either Clinton or Trump, and they instead chose to vote for another person, right? And those 7 did not even vote for the same individual. So of those 7, we had, I want to say, 5 different people receiving votes. Basically the party, okay, determines who the electors are going to be. And theoretically, they are people that would act in the manner that is best fitting to the party. And those electors cast their vote supposedly based upon the will of the people, which means that a plurality of the votes go to an individual candidate. All of the electoral votes go to that individual candidate. All right? The system is created that way in order to try to ensure that we receive an actual majority in terms of electing the president, right? Because if we go back and we look historically, there were times where you had 4 or 5 real legitimate candidates who were running for president, right? So if you have 4 or 5 legitimate candidates that are all vying to become president, the odds of any one of those individuals receiving 51% of the vote is really slim, right? We have 2 real candidates, and neither Trump nor Clinton could get to 50%. Okay? And that's actually fairly common. All right? So what that leads us to is a situation where we need the president to get over 50%, because if you elect a president off of plurality only, it makes it harder for the president to do his job. Now, why is that? It's a basic concept of this. And go back and look at the Republican primaries, because the Republican primaries are a really good example of what I'm referring to. in the Republican primary system, you had a large number of candidates that were all running in individual state primary elections. Donald Trump won a number of those primaries, receiving roughly 30% of the vote. And he won all or a majority of the delegates from those individual states. Now, what that means is that 7 out of 10 people did not like Donald Trump, yet he won anyways. And so if you end up in a situation where we're electing a president, and that president only has the support of 3 out of 10 people, it's going to be a lot harder for them to get anything accomplished or to rally the country or to actually be able to sort of espouse this ideology of I'm the president of the United States, when most Americans are going to sit there and look at you and be like, dude, you're the president of 30 people, right? We don't care. All right? So that's how we end up with an electoral system. That's why somebody like Donald Trump can run around today and be like, no, man, I got a mandate. Like, I won big. Dude, you lost a popular election. You claim you won big. Right? And his big win is not, I mean, it's not huge, right? I mean, if you go back and you look, let me find you a big one, right? So 1972, right? Richard Nixon got 520 electoral college votes. 520. There's how many? 538. That's a landslide. Right? That's a mandate. Right? If you go back to like 1960, no, 64, there it is. Right? 486 to 52. Again, landslide. Right? 310 to, what did Clinton end up with? Like 253 or whatever it was. Not really a mandate. Okay? Not on the same level. But it does, if you just look at the numbers in that level, it does seem like Trump won rather handily, right? It wasn't that close. 310 to 250. Right? So it paints a very different picture. Now, like I said, you need 270 to win. That's one more than half, right? You could end up with a 269 to 269 tie. If you end up with a tie or you end up with a situation in which no one receives an actual majority, the vote goes to the House of Representatives. And in the House of Representatives, each state gets one vote. What that means is that the state of Texas gets one vote for all of its millions of people. The state of Wyoming, with its 640,000 people, gets one vote. All right? Now, here's where it gets even trickier. Because there are how many representatives in the state of Texas? 36. Good. We can do math. Right? 36 divided by 2 is 18. Right? So what happens if 18 vote for one candidate and 18 want to vote for the other candidate? Texas now has to abstain. So they get no vote. Alright? Which makes it even more difficult to determine what's going on. Now that goes to the House of Representatives. Historically, the way the Electoral College works is that if it goes to the House of Representatives, then the Senate selects the Vice President. You have to realize, though, that when we started this whole process of electing presidents, electors actually cast 2 votes. Okay? Whoever received the most votes was President of the United States. Whoever received the second most votes was Vice President. All right? We changed that sort of process much later once we had a situation in which our Vice President was sort of tacked onto or ran in addition to the President, and then you voted essentially for the 2 of them together. All right? Criticisms, obviously you're looking at that, or at least some of them in the documents that you have. Right? We know that you can end up in a situation in which a president who does not receive a majority or even a plurality of the vote becomes the next president of the United States. This would being the 5th time in history that it's happened. But if you look at that, 5 times, and all of the times we've elected a president of the United States, it's only happened 5 times. Twice this century, though. Right? So we're 2 for 5. 40% of our elections in this century, we've elected the guy who did not receive the majority or even the plurality of the popular vote. Right? Which is one of the criticisms on why we should get rid of it. All right? Faithless electors are actually supposed to be a criticism. All right? To understand, this is a complex concept to understand now. Because every state has its own regulations. And the state of Hawaii, for instance, they actually had a faithless elector this time around. Hawaii went for Clinton. He did not vote for Clinton. He voted for Bernie Sanders. Right? Anybody want to guess what happened to him? Nothing happened to him. He broke the law. Technically, he broke the law in the state of Hawaii. Yet, Hawaii still counted his vote. The national government still counted his vote. And Hawaii did nothing to him because Hawaii has never actually put in what the penalty is for doing this. They said it's against the law, but they never said what's going to happen to you if it does. And now, I will actually tell you this. Based on the Constitution of the United States of America, I think that any of these penalties are actually unconstitutional. I personally believe that. Okay? That is my own interpretation of the Constitution. You do not necessarily have to believe that the same way. But that, and if you go back, and I forget the Federalist paper that it is, again, if we had more time, I would have made you read the Federalist paper as well, the individual essay that refers to the Electoral College. Because it actually talks about how the Electoral College is a sort of safety net to ensure that we do not elect some sort of narcissistic demigod to become president of the United States because he mobilizes the people who are stupid and think that he's awesome, right? Because he, I don't know, convinces them that he's awesome. When in reality he has no business actually running the government or being the president of the United States. The electors in that case are actually, in my opinion, supposed to be faithless. Right? Which is sad because there was an elector in the state of Texas specifically who resigned. Because he basically said that he will not break his word, and his word was that he would vote for Trump, and he will not vote for Trump because Trump was not qualified. So he resigned and they replaced him with somebody who would vote for Trump. Alright, other criticisms, and some of these now here are out of date, right? If we end up in a situation where it does go to the House of Representatives, which really isn't going to happen, small states are overrepresented, alright? So they get more power, which isn't necessarily fair. And then the whole Electoral College system really does inhibit third parties. And like I said, we will go over that when we actually go over third parties and what third parties do, right? Or how we end up in a situation in America where third parties do not exist, all right? Because ultimately they just don't. All right, so what are our alternatives then? We can have a direct election, and everybody's vote counts the same. All right? We could have what's called a district system. And so you understand, anybody see the purple number right here? And Nebraska and Maine are two states that already do this. They have a district system. And so what happens is that in a district system, you take the House of Representative districts. And if you win that district, you get the one electoral college vote for that district. All right? So when you look at Nebraska, for instance, there's 3 districts in Nebraska, right? 5 seats. So there's 3 congressional districts. All right? If you win 1 congressional district, you get 1 electoral vote. If you win 2 congressional districts, you get 2 electoral votes. If you win 3 congressional districts, you get an automatic 5. Okay? Because the other 2, basically the Senate, those go to the state as a whole. So it would be theoretically possible to dominate 1 congressional district so much that you win that 1 congressional district, barely lose the other 2, but receiving plurality of votes in the state as a whole and take the 2 Senate seats. So it could be 3-2, although that's very rare. You don't see that very frequently. All right. With Maine, they only have the 2 districts, so it's even less likely. Although I think, so Nebraska, if I remember correctly, went all 5 for Trump. I think Maine, this time around, actually split, and Trump did get 1 district in Maine. Okay? If I remember correctly. All right, a proportional system. So there, the candidate gets the same number or same percentage of electoral votes as the candidate got in terms of the actual popular votes. And then there's also the idea of here of keeping sort of the electoral votes, but getting rid of the electors. So removing yourself or removing any sort of situation in which you could have faithless electors. All right. So those are some of the alternatives.